Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Effective Grant Writing webinar. We're going to go ahead and get started here. We would like to take a moment to thank Highmark Foundation for sponsoring this webinar today. My name is Allie Lipsett-Simpson, and I'm the Education Program Associate here at the Penn State Hershey Pro Wellness Center. And joining me today is Alicia Hoke, Project Manager at the Pro Wellness Center. A few housekeeping points to get us started. All participant phones and microphones have been muted to ensure the information shared by all presenters can be heard clearly. If you would like to submit a question or a comment for the Q&A session, you can enter that in the question box. We will reserve time at the end of the webinar to answer submitted questions. The webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording and handouts will be emailed following the webinar. And a link to the certificate of completion and follow-up survey will also be included in this email. We have a very exciting agenda this afternoon, so thank you again for joining us. The key items that we will cover during today's session include an overview of the Pro Wellness Center, an overview of grants, keys to navigating a grant application, and upcoming grant opportunities. At the end of this webinar, attendees should be able to identify the impact of a champion in preparing a grant application, recognize the purpose of each component of a grant application, and understand the important role that data plays in the application process and the implementation of the project. I'd like to share a little bit of information about the center. Here at Penn State Hershey Pro Wellness Center, we are committed to educating and inspiring youth and their families to eat well, engage in regular physical activity, and become champions for bringing healthy choices to life. The PRO in our name stands for Prevention, Research, and Outreach. Examples of resources based on this acronym and our work can be found on our website. The vision of our center is to reduce the incidence rate of childhood obesity. We aim to be a trusted resource for educational programming, collaborative partnerships, and proven interventions in schools, communities, and like-minded organizations. Our funded work is primarily in schools. We work within over 400 schools through our Healthy Champions program, the Department of Health 1305 program, and Highmark Foundation's Creating a Healthy School Environment grant program. Our website has many resources, including the opportunity to sign your school or community-based organization to be a Healthy Champion. Our Healthy Champions program is available for schools and community-based organizations in Pennsylvania and includes resources like event planning guides, promotional templates, customized champion reports, future funding priority, and Hershey Bears incentives. To register as a Healthy Champion, visit pennstatehershey.org/prowellness/champs. Annual registration is required to receive your welcome kit at the beginning of each school year. Registration for the 15-16 school year will open in April. Your Healthy Champions Welcome Kit will include posters for our 4 signature events, including Walk To or At School Day in October, Apple Crunch in October, Go for the Greens in March, and Move It Outside in May. So let's get started. What is a grant? A grant is funding provided to a group or organization and is designated for a specific purpose. It addresses an identified need or problem in which the school or organization needs additional funding in order to tackle. A grant is a win-win for both the funder and the recipient. Grant opportunities can be found in many places, including government websites, foundations and agencies, and even newsletters from professional organizations. Grant funding often comes with specific stipulations or parameters on who can apply and how the funding can be used. The process through which funders request applications for grants can be called a variety of names, including a request for proposal, which can be called an RFP, or a request for application. For our purposes today, we will refer to the document you will prepare as an application. When you think about applying for grant funding, you will want to be able to identify specific need to address. For example, you want to increase the wellness of your students and staff. And perhaps that need could be addressed by piloting a new program or expanding an existing project. And support is incredibly important when you think about writing for a grant. Grant funding can provide the stepping stone to get a program started. It can help to build support for your particular wellness initiative through your school or organization. The hope is that administrators and others will see the important impact your program or initiative is making and support the program and its outcomes. Having the right support can lead to having a sustainable program. One key person in that support system is a champion. Champions are leaders in health and wellness within schools. They can be health or PE instructors, nurses, or anyone with an interest in health and wellness of students and staff. The champion is vital to the success of the project or program. They are responsible for representing the project to the funder, and they ensure the right people are at the table and work to move the project forward. So how do you apply? You have an idea and you need funding, and this idea can come from wellness council priorities or assessment results that you might have. Then you look for a source. Some sources can include places like our Pro Wellness listing, and Healthy Champion schools receive this information first. Or you can look to the Spark PE Finder or the Highmark Foundation. When you're planning to apply, read the guidelines and instructions to determine the fit. Ensure that you meet the eligibility standards for the grant. And then share your ideas to gain support. Talk with your wellness councils and administrators, and then write the grant application. I'd like to note that it might seem like a daunting task to complete the grant application among all of the other tasks that you have to do during the day. But there are a lot of grant opportunities available, and in fact, some funders can't give away all of their funding, so it's most certainly worth the time and the effort. So now that we've talked a little bit about what leads up to writing a grant application, I would like to introduce Alicia Hoke to talk in more depth about grant applications and how to make yours stand out. Thanks, Allie. So this section of the presentation is designed to break down common sections of a grant application. But before we really get into this section, I'd like to take a moment to ask the people on the webinar today what their history is in completing grant applications. So I'm launching a poll, which you should see on your screen momentarily. And if you could take a moment and answer the poll as to how many grants you have applied for in your history. And if you haven't applied for any, you don't have to answer the poll, of course, and we'll be able to see that as well. So I'm seeing the results come in now. I'll give it another moment, but it looks like almost everybody has voted. Okay, so I'm going to close the poll, share here. And as I suspected, we have a pretty wide variety of history with grant applications on the webinar today, which is exciting because I think that there's information in this webinar for people of all stages of grant preparation, those who have never completed a grant application before and those who are seasoned with more than 7 applications in their toolbox. Okay, so let's start with the basics of the application information. So first things first, this may seem like common sense, but read the entire application prior to completing any part of it. I think that's the first thing we're taught in elementary school when we're reading our tests or when we're taking a test is that we're supposed to read all the instructions before we answer any questions. And so the same thing applies for grant applications. This will allow you to know what pieces of the grant application will require the most time to complete them, and it will allow you to get a timely start on requesting information from other people. Sometimes grant applications require information from administrators or PE teachers or health teachers or classroom teachers, all of the above. So it's good to make sure you're getting your requests in from those people in time. Reading the application instructions also helps to ensure eligibility. Your time is valuable, and so you don't want to spend it completing an application only to find out that you're not actually eligible for that particular grant. Some grants require a financial match, so that if the grant gives so much money, a certain percentage match is also required from your organization. And so you want to be aware of whether or not that's acceptable to your organization and if it's required. And some grants also require a community partner, and so ensuring that you have those individuals or those organizations lined up ahead of time is also important. You also want to acknowledge in your application, if it's requested, whether you're applying for an individual school or you're applying for an entire school district. This ties directly to eligibility criteria and expectations for the reach of your program. You also want to complete every field in question that's available to you. You don't want to leave anything blank, even if that means just putting a note that it's not applicable, because that helps grant reviewers realize that you completed your application. Leaving blank spaces or not putting any information in may make grant reviewers think that you didn't take the time to finish all of the fields. The next one is to ask questions. So if you're unsure of how to complete a field or question, or you just have general eligibility questions related to the grant, you should ask the administrator of the grant. And the great thing about a lot of the grants that we're aware of or that we've helped with in the past is that there's always somebody who can answer those questions. And so you should really take the time to ask them. And finally, check and double check your information. Spelling errors not only look sloppy, but they can be frustrating to grant administrators when they're trying to award the grants. If your contact information, like your email address or your phone number, is not correct, it makes it extra difficult to get the great news that you've been an award recipient out to those recipients. Grant reviewers go through a lot of applications when they're deciding who to award. And so even though some of the things on this slide seem like common sense, these errors are noticeable in applications, and even the best grant program can be put to the bottom of the pile because you haven't completed all of the information. Okay. So the next thing is program description. So when you're thinking about writing your program description, you want to gather some information. You want to ask some critical questions, like who is the population who's going to benefit from the grant, and how many individuals will benefit from it as well. So defining your target audience. It's also good here to think about some of the money related to the population that you're going to be working with. So a large monetary request often reaches a larger audience. But in some cases, there's a need for a larger dollar amount to reach a smaller audience. In those situations, your thoughts for the program should be well thought out and targeted, and your application should explain clearly why the larger sum of money is beneficial for the smaller group of individuals. And it shows a really thought out plan. The next thing is to explain the need. Show evidence or gather your evidence for why you're making the request. Are you building on a previous project? Have you piloted a project in the past and you're looking to expand the reach, maybe double your numbers or reach new populations? Talk about the success of that project. Are you using assessment results? Did you complete a needs assessment and you identified a space for improvement, and so you're requesting a grant to do an initiative in that area? I'll talk a little bit more about that in the coming slides. And what are your qualifications for writing the grant or for asking for the grant money? What evidence is there that you'll utilize the dollars appropriately and have success with your program? Another great opportunity to talk about successful partnerships or grants that you've had in the past. And all this information was gathered to be put into your grant application. Let's take a moment and talk about needs assessments. And some of you may know these as school health assessments. They come under a variety of names. And how a school health assessment or a needs assessment can help you to prepare for completing a grant application. So a needs assessment is a snapshot in time of initiatives, wellness initiatives, or wellness practices going on in your school or district. If they're completed annually, they help to measure progress over time. And what the information gathered from an assessment does is it highlights areas of health and wellness in which the school excels and where there are areas for improvement. When you complete the needs assessment, it provides guidance for wellness councils, administrators, teachers, and parents. And the results help you to create an action plan or to create a list of items that you'd like to improve upon. and then therefore help you to create goals, objectives, and overall strategy. Completing a needs assessment strengthens an application. It provides evidence that there's need in a funding area, and it tells funders that you have a clear goal and that your grant application and being awarded a grant is a means to meet that goal. Here at Pro Wellness, we often participate in reviewing grant applications, and in our history, we haven't always seen people identify needs assessment data as the driving force behind writing the grant. But we're also here to tell you that if we saw that in a grant application more often, those would be the applications that were getting pulled to the top of the pile. So these are some organizations that offer needs assessment tools. The Alliance for a Healthier Generation offers the Healthy Schools Program Framework. Let's Move Active Schools has an assessment tool. The United States Department of Agriculture Food and Nutrition Service, through their Teen Nutrition Program, offers the Healthier U.S. School Challenge, or HUSK. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention offer the School Health Index. Action for Healthy Kids has an assessment tool. And Penn State Hershey Pro Wellness Center also has a brief assessment for enrolling in our Healthy Champions program, which also is considered a needs assessment. So getting back into the program description, it's really all in the details. So the program description should really give you the who, what, when, where, and why. And it should also go well with your timeline for completion. And so when you're creating your who, what, when, where, and how, you really want to think about whether or not your deliverables are going to occur within the timeline in which your grant will be awarded and the amount of time you have to complete that project. And don't leave gaps. So some projects, some applications come with an idea or a program, but it's a little bit bigger than the scope of that particular grant application or that granting mechanism. And so sometimes programs have other parts, whether it's staffing or giveaways or anything like that, that come from other funding sources or in-kind contributions. And it's important to include that in your application because it shows that there are multiple pieces coming together to create a well-rounded program. Sometimes applications come in and people are asking for one specific part of a program while they know in their minds that they're getting funding or in-kind contribution for the remaining part of the program. The funder and the reviewers don't know that, and so it may look as though the program is not fully thought out and is not well-rounded, but in fact it is. It just wasn't included in the application. Okay, so we've talked about applicant information and program description. So now let's talk a little bit about goals and objectives. The next section is not always included in an application, and a lot of times if it's included, it's not clearly defined as goals and objectives. But funders are looking for this type of information. If it's not in the application, even if it's not requested in the application, and it's part of the grant implementation, which is a very worthwhile discussion for today. Your goals and objectives set a path for what you'd like to accomplish over the course of your funding time. But one thing that you really want to consider is, what is a reasonable objective? A reasonable objective is something that can be accomplished within the time frame of the grant. It should also be able to be accomplished within the funds that you request in your application, and of course taking into consideration any other funding sources or in-kind contributions. Your objectives should be supportive of an overall goal, and that goal may be something that takes several years to accomplish. You want to tie your goals and objectives to making progress in areas identified for improvement in your needs assessment. And you always want to keep your goals and objectives SMART: specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. And if you didn't catch that, there's a slide later that has it all spelled out for you. You also want to check to see if your funder has already outlined the type of data they're expecting you to collect as a stipulation of receiving the award. This expectation is actually becoming more clear in requests for applications released by funders. We're in a climate now where requirements for showing the impact of grant dollars is becoming higher. So your grant funders are requesting even more for you to show the change you're making with those grant dollars. But even small steps and small changes are measurable and valuable. Now let's talk a little bit about data. And as the title of my slide indicates, it's really not as scary as it sounds. Data is not something that all applications ask you to think about ahead of time. But it will save you considerable effort after you're awarded if you think a little bit about it while you're writing your application. Your data sources are tied directly to your goals and objectives and help you to measure success. For example, if you were implementing a new PE curriculum, you wouldn't use school lunch participation data to determine if the new curriculum was effective. You'd likely look at fitness assessments or PE participation rates. And we know that schools are hard-pressed to find additional time for programs, let alone trying to look for the data sources. But it doesn't have to be complicated. There are lots of types of data that are already collected within a school, and some of those sources may be perfect measurements for measuring your program's success. Some of them are on the screen, things like behavior referrals, absenteeism data, general health history, fitness assessments, and participation rates for breakfast, lunch programs, before and after school programs, and even overall trends in your school. Things like parent involvement and, parents and students showing up to activities, those types of things. One common source of data that's not on this list is student body mass index data. And it's not on this list because it's not important, but there are a lot of factors that contribute to a student's BMI, and it's a piece of data that's not likely to change quickly. So it may not change across the life of your program, especially if you're funded for a one-year grant. But just because this measurement, if you collect BMI data, just because that measurement doesn't change, doesn't mean that your program isn't positively affecting that data. This is why it's really important to collect other types of information, like those that you see on the slide, because these types of information are likely to change as a direct effect of your program. For instance, you could see participation rates increase 30%, or behavior referrals decrease 15%, but you will likely never see BMI data shift that high of a percentage in a one-year grant. It's important to remember that BMI data is a type of demographic data, similar to the grades you're serving or the age groups you're serving with the grant dollars. Picking an appropriate data source that can truly be affected by the implementation of your grant will show your funder and your administrators and your students and staff that your program was valuable. Okay, so last but incredibly important is the budget. When developing your budget, there are several things that you really want to pay close attention to. You want to be aware of ineligible expenses. These are expenses that the grant awarder will not allow you to spend your funding on. Examples of these include food, staff time for existing services, and sometimes sales tax. A lot of times these stipulations are included in the grant information, the RFA or the RFP, but if you have a concern, it's definitely worth asking. You also want to think about sustainability. Long gone are the days where grant funders simply award dollars to purchase equipment or purchase non-sustainable items that don't have some sort of policy or program change associated with them. You also want to make your budget realistic. Think about who you propose to reach, how many students you propose to reach, and if the dollars that you're assigning to that reach match up. So did you propose to reach 1,000 students, but you only asked for programming that reaches 200? These are the types of things that grant reviewers will look for, the matchup between the proposal and the budget to make sure that everything goes together and is cohesive. Something else you want to take into consideration is having a backup plan. So you'd want to have an idea of how your program would function if you weren't awarded the total amount you were requested. Would you cut the total reach? Would you keep the reach but cut some of the components? While you won't find in an application an opportunity for you to write your backup plan, it's important to keep this information in mind because a lot of grants are funded for less than the original request. A little disclaimer I'd like to also include with that, though, is if you're thoughtful in the information you put in your budget and you aren't including ineligible expenses, or you're asking about particular expenses before you're including them in your final submission, you might be able to avoid some of the common reduction in budget, which often results from removing ineligible expenses from the final award. So we've talked about all of these sections independently, but it's important to realize that the lines are often blurry between these sections of a grant application when you actually are compiling the application. For example, you may have one large text box that asks you to include a description of your program, including the who, the what, the when, the where, but also the goals and objectives. But those particular components may not be individually described. You also want to think about how the segments separately to ensure that you've included all of the details that you need. And then in that way, you will have created a well thought out program to be included for review by the reviewers. So let's recap. First, when you're thinking about writing a grant, you want to make sure that you're obtaining support for your program. And support can come from your administrators, from your wellness council, from your school community. You then want to make sure that you've read all of the guidelines for the RFA or the RFP carefully, and that you're qualified to write for that particular grant. You want to create a needs statement that's well documented, and remember, one of the ways to document this is to use a needs assessment data report and to show your potential funders that your information for your need came from taking an actual assessment of what's going on in your school or organization. You want to clearly explain your program, the who, how, what, when, where, all of those details. You want to keep your goals and objectives SMART. This is the specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely information that should be included when writing goals and objectives. You want to be mindful of sustainability. Are you writing for equipment that's supported by a program? Will all of your equipment be used up after the first time after the first time through the program? Those are things to keep in mind. You want to provide a reasonable and a detailed budget, always keeping in mind ineligible expenses and asking questions, if you have them, about what is able to be funded. And finally, you want to proofread your final submission. Don't let your application end up on the bottom of the pile because it didn't include all of the necessary components. Okay, and with that, I'd like to hand the presentation back to Allie.
Thanks, Elisa. So because you're on this webinar, you have the opportunity to get a first look at an upcoming grant opportunity from the Highmark Foundation. The Creating a Healthy School Environment Grant for the 2015-2016 school year is available to schools K through 12 in the areas served by Highmark. This includes 49 counties in Pennsylvania, 21 of those are in central PA, and 28 of those are in western PA. It also includes all 55 counties in West Virginia. Grants will be awarded for evidence-based programs that address one of the following topics: bullying prevention, child injury prevention, healthy eating and physical activity, and physical and environmental health. Applications will only be accepted using the web-based application, and those sent by fax or email will not be reviewed. So again, this goes back to what we were talking about, to make sure you read the instructions. Applications will be accepted until May 8th, and awards will be announced on June 30th, 2015. The grant application will also be available via the Highmark Foundation website or through a link on the Pro Wellness website. So now that we've covered what makes a great grant application, we'd like to offer you the opportunity to ask us questions. So reminder that you can submit questions on the side of your screen in the questions box. We'd be happy to answer them.
Okay, so while we're having people drop some questions in the questions box, we have a couple already that we'll go ahead and get started with. So one of the questions that came through was, if my proposal is not funded, can I contact the grant reviewer for comments or advice? And the short answer to this is yes, with an exclamation point. You should always go back to your grant reviewers if the opportunity is available to ask for words of advice or areas of the grant application that maybe weren't strong enough to be funded, because oftentimes the grant opportunity is available in subsequent years, and you can make your application better and you can submit it again in the next funding cycle. And as I mentioned earlier, oftentimes the grant applications or the grant opportunities have an administrator that is available to answer questions.
So another question is, if a grant proposal is funded, but for less than the requested amount, where can I go to find funds to supplement the program? It's a great question.
So there's actually several answers to this question, and one of them is that you can look to supplement the program with specific people in your community. So whether that's your administrators, sometimes school budgets have some flexibility to assist within grant world, but we also know that school budgets can be very, very tight, and that's not always an opportunity that's available to everybody. Another great place is the PTO and PTA. They oftentimes offer great programs and things for students and families, but maybe they also have some availability in their funds that they could help supplement a grant request.
So we have, are you?
Yep.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Let's see here. We've got another one that came in that said, can you talk more about needs assessments?
And that's a great question. And if we have a little more time as we reach closer to the end of this webinar period, we can address more about needs assessments. But what I will say is that we did deliver a webinar on needs assessments several months ago, and you can actually find that recorded, archived version on our website. So the website that you see on our screen now is pennstatehershey.org/pro-wellness/grants. If you replace the word grants with webinars, you'll reach our archived webinars page, and there's an entire webinar talking specifically about needs assessments and school health assessments, so that might be helpful. But just in short, the needs assessment or the school health assessment really gives you that picture of where there's room for improvement in wellness initiatives or wellness policy and practice within your school or school district or organization. And then what that does for your grant application is shows your potential funders that you've done evidence-based research to figure out what areas for improvement your school or organization has. And then you can tell your funders, hey, I did this assessment and this is what we found, and this was an evidence-based way to look at where we could get better in the areas of wellness. And funders really like to see that there's thought process behind the request. Okay, we also have another comment here about the reporting related to grants. So one thing to keep in mind when you apply for a grant is that it is a two-way street. So that while you may be getting funding to implement a program, your funders are looking for something in return. They're looking for the opportunity to show their board or their supervisors that the money was well spent. And so oftentimes one of the requirements for receiving an award is to have to report back on the success of your program. And unfortunately, sometimes people who are awarded grant dollars get caught up in the program that they're delivering, and it becomes a secondary thought that there's a report that also needs to be included. But your funder doesn't forget that, so it's important to remember to keep that at the forefront. And it's extremely important to remember to report and to deliver on time, or you may not be considered for subsequent funding cycles. Okay. So just a reminder, we'll take another couple of questions here if any come in. We also realize that we have till 4:30 today, but we also recognize that in our area it's a sunny day, so if people want to get out early, we can also make that happen as well. After this webinar, you will find on our website a copy of the questions that we answered today and any other relevant information that we will include in a one-page handout for you. The grant writing tips will also be included there along with the archived version of this webinar and the slides that we used today.
So if I am not seeing any other questions come through, just so you all know, these are ways to stay connected to us that we have up on the screen. So if questions come up, we're seeing more questions come in actually right now, and we'll get to these. And if after we are finished, don't hesitate to let us know if you have other questions after we get off of the webinar. All the things on the screen right now, they're great ways to get connected to us, and we will answer any of your questions. So let's see here, another question. This is a great one. The question is, are there keywords that help a grant get awarded? So things we should think about.
Yeah, that's great. I would say maybe less important than keywords are a thoughtful and well thought through organization of the application. So something that shows that you have evidence to show that there was a need. You described clearly the population and the reach that would be awarded or affected if the award was given. And then what your plans are, what your overall goal is with that. So it's really less about the key words and more about the cohesiveness and the thought through planning that goes into the application.
Great. So we also had a question about, do you have a specific set of guidelines when reporting?
That's also a great question. So every funder will have their own set of guidelines for reporting. In some of the grants that we've worked with in the past, oftentimes it is a baseline, as they call it, data collection. So something that that your funder will ask you to share some type of data ahead of time, ahead of the intervention, so to speak, or ahead of the program. And then at the end, you'll be asked to share that same set of data, but updated. So you'll look at how that data will have changed as a direct result of the program that you implemented. And that's often what's included in the reporting for lots of types of granting mechanisms. Sometimes there's also a narrative that is included in a final report, lessons learned, things of that nature. But every grant funder will have their own system and their own requirements.
So another question is, so writing the narrative can be so daunting. Any tips on how to be prolific while staying on point?
That's great. So I really think, and for as many grant applications as I have been involved in reviewing, I've also been on the writing end of several of them. So I can definitely appreciate the daunting nature of a narrative. But I like to think of it like this.
So before you jump right into that open-ended text box and put all your information in, I like to take inventory of each of the sections that you'd like to complete. So thinking about your reach and thinking about your timeline and your goals and objectives. And if you can segment that out, I think it's easier when you get into the narrative to pick the most important pieces or the high-level pieces that can be included in that section. It's definitely, I agree, it's definitely easier to fill out an application that has specific sections outlined and identified that you can sort of input your information very concisely and answer a question very directly. But if that's not the case for an application, I recommend taking it apart like that and then putting it back together.
Great. And if anyone has more questions, please feel free to put them in the questions box. We'd be happy to answer them. We have a couple minutes left.
These are some really thoughtful questions today, and I appreciate everybody who took the time to drop one in the questions and comments box. These questions, I think, are very similar to others that we've had in the past, and also I realize I'm certain will help other people on the webinar today who maybe didn't ask the question but was thinking it. So I really appreciate you taking the time to jot your questions down.
Okay. So with no other questions coming into the box, I'll remind you that on the screen is some of our contact information and ways to get in touch with us. And we'd like to thank you all for joining us, and we would really like to thank Highmark again, the Highmark Foundation, for sponsoring this webinar. Again, reach out to us if you would like to ask us any more questions. All the information is on your screen. So thank you.
Thank you.